You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Well, hello and welcome to TFM's local books and comic show for Star Trek, and I am just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing. I'm so excited to be here as we have so much to talk about this episode, and with me is none other than the one and only Casey Pettitt. Casey, how are you?
I am doing good. We just, there's so much Star Trek coming out in the literary and comic world right now. It is our cup runneth over with Star Trek fiction, so and nonfiction, I guess, too. So yeah, you know, it's a good time to be a Star Trek literary fan.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you. You know, with all that we have in this news segment, it is jam packed. So we'll get to that in just a moment. We wanted to thank everybody for listening to us. We really do appreciate everybody, connecting with us, listening to us. Of course, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be able to hear every single show that we do. Make sure that you do that. We'd really appreciate you subscribing on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening. If you can give us a star rating review, that would really help. And in fact, Casey has an extra copy of the book that we're going to be covering today, Making It So by Patrick Stewart. And so we want to be able to give that away to you. And the best way to be able to do that is through a contest with Apple Podcasts. So anyone reviewing us starting from the release of this episode, which will, as we're recording this, it'll be just a few days. So when you listen to this episode, if you haven't given us a star rating review on the Apple Podcast platform, go over and do so. It does need to be in the U.S. store, so that way Casey can ship the book to you as well. And we will pick a winner here at the end of November. So we've got all of November for you to be able to do this. And we can't wait to be able to give this book to you. Casey and I, we're going to be talking about it in the feature, and honestly, I think both of us would agree this is worthwhile for not only Star Trek fans, but anybody who's just interested in the life of a Hollywood legend. Mm-hmm. And so we're very excited to be able to give this away to somebody. Of course, you can also follow us all over social media and keep track of everything at Trek FM. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Trek FM. There is a listeners-only discussion group that you can join called the Babel Conference. That's got listeners from all over the world in it, talking about the different shows that we're doing here on the network. You can also find us online at Trek.fm and see all of the shows that are coming out. And if you want to make sure that all of the shows do keep coming to you, become a patron over at patreon.com/TrekFM. Casey Pettitt and Greg Rosier are patrons here of Literary Treks. We really appreciate their support, because without listeners just like them, these shows can't keep coming to you each and every week. So we really encourage you to go do that. And with all of that said, Casey, like we mentioned, we have an incredible news segment because there's just so much news that has been coming out about Star Trek books. One sad note that at front, we're only going to have one sad note, and the rest is going to be, I think, pretty awesome. But the making of a Star Trek Picard book actually has been pushed back a little bit. If you've ordered this, you would have gotten an email there from some place like Amazon letting you know that be the case. The release date for that is now in February on the 27th. So I'm not quite sure why that would be the case. My guess is probably just printing issues or something like that. So that will not be coming out until February 27th next year in 2024. So that's the only bit of sad news. But my goodness, Casey, do we have an incredible run of great news when it comes to new Star Trek fiction that is going to be coming out in 2024.
Yeah, New York Comic Con, I think, is where all this news came from. And I don't think anybody was expecting any book news to come out of something like a Comic Con. But, with the strikes happening on the television and, feature film mediums, we got some opportunities to see these things. And the first new one that's coming out on May 21st, 2024 is a Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine book from our friend Dayton Ward. So he's got a new one coming out called Pliable Truths. And I don't know, Matt, should I just read the blurb?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think this one sounds incredibly interesting.
Yeah, so the year's 2369. Shortly after Starfleet thwarts a Cardassian attack on a Federation star system, the Cardassian government orders an end to its 50-year occupation of the planet Bajor. As a result, a newly installed Bajoran government requests immediate assistance from the Federation to mediate how the withdrawal will proceed and what recompense, if any, Bajorans are owed from their brutal oppressors. Captain Jean-Luc Picard is ordered by Starfleet Command to oversee these tense negotiations on Terok Nor, the massive Cardassian space station still orbiting Bajor, even as he still deals with his own recent trauma as a prisoner held and tortured by a Cardassian interrogator. As these critical peace talks get underway, Ensign Ro Laren receives a call for help from a friend thought long dead, exposing an insidious secret from inside Cardassian space. Now, Picard and the crew of the Starship Enterprise must act to prevent an interstellar incident from reigniting deadly hostilities between the Federation and the Cardassians and shattering any hope of justice for the Bajoran people.
I mean, I don't know if this book could sound any more epic by, setting up the stage for Deep Space Nine as a series. And I think even legitimizing more so, why Picard is there at the station in the first place in the first episode. I think making that the case. And, to me, honestly, one of the most exciting things about this book is that idea that Picard dealing with the fallout of his experience and with the torture. And to me, that's a really, really interesting idea to bring up here, and not something that, the show, of course, really ever dealt with at all. And so this book sounds phenomenal.
Yeah, I definitely can't wait for this one. It seems like the story that we never knew we needed or wanted. And I think in the hands of Dayton Ward, we're going to be in for something special. I've always thought Captain Picard in that first episode of Deep Space Nine seemed a little bit more hardened. I mean, the attitude he was getting from Sisko was, probably a little hard on Picard, but coming off the heels of being tortured by the Cardassians, it stands to reason that Picard probably doesn't really want to be there any more than Sisko does right now. And also having Ro Laren in this book is interesting too, because, a lot of us know that when they were creating Deep Space Nine, they wanted Michelle Forbes to play Ro Laren, right, as the Bajoran liaison. And when Michelle Forbes passed on that opportunity, they created the character of Kira. So I'm kind of curious if they're going to kind of almost retcon that in a little bit as having Ro intending to be there. Maybe not, but I mean, just still cool to see Ro, involved in a Deep Space Nine story long before the relaunch series.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Ro, too, is I think it allows you to be able to connect to where they go with the character in Picard, and her history there. So I think that's going to be very interesting. And, again, like you said, and I think you said it really well, this is kind of a story we just never knew we always needed. And this is the type of place where you truly can fill in a lot of those gaps, right? And create really interesting stories. And this is a fantastic story idea. For the next book that's going to be coming out there in July 23 of 2024, it's going to be by Greg Cox. It's called Lost to Eternity. And they say about this book, because it's a Star Trek movie era book, which I'm a huge fan of, 3 eras, 3 mysteries, 1 ancient enemy. And it says, in 2024, almost 40 years ago, maritime biologist Gillian Anderson stormed away from her dream job at San Francisco's Cetacean Institute and was never seen or heard from again. And now a true crime podcast has reopened that cold case. But investigator Melinda Silver has no idea her search for the truth about Gillian's disappearance will ultimately stretch across time and space and attract the attention of a ruthless obsessive with his own secret agenda. 2268, the USS Enterprise's 5-year mission is interrupted when James T. Kirk and his crew set out to recover an abducted Federation scientist whose classified secrets are being sought by the Klingons as well. The trail leads to a barbaric world off limits to both Starfleet and the Klingon Empire, and an ageless mastermind on a quest for eternity. 2292. The Osori, an ancient alien species, has finally agreed to establish relations with its much younger neighbors, the Federation, the Klingons, and the Romulans, a joint mission involving ships from all 3 powers, including the Enterprise A, turns explosive when one of those sorry envoys is apparently killed. Each side blames the other, but the truth lies buried deep, nearly 300 years in the past. Wow.
Wow, indeed. And, it's great seeing Greg Cox come back. We haven't had anything from him in a long time, and he even noted that when he was posting about this on social media that, he's almost coming back to this. I think he's probably had an original series book a few years ago, but it's been a while, and he's one of the greats, and this sounds pretty epic. It'd be nice to see some tie-ins to Star Trek 4 and the original series and the rest of the movie era. These time spanning stories are always fun, and just looking forward to seeing where this one goes. It's nice. Sounds like a nice little standalone book here.
Yeah, I think again, one of the things that we've talked about many times is really finding those cracks that you have and filling in places that like we talked about with that first book. That we were mentioning, like, we didn't even know we needed this story. And, I think this is another thing to follow up on the story with Star Trek 4 and Gillian Armstrong, I think is really interesting. It's something that, I've always kind of wanted. I know the book Probe follows up on that, but I also know that book has a really tortured history with the story that the author wanted to tell and the book that actually became what it is. And so all of this sounds really great. And of course, anytime in the movie era, there's so much wiggle room with places to play here. I'm really fascinated to see, where we go with this, and especially to, hitting anything that's going to have the Enterprise A in it. I'm a fan of. So, yeah. But we also have a new comic that got announced at New York Comic Con, Sons of Star Trek. And this is going to be a comic that, just as it implies, it takes a closer look at some of the famous sons of the franchise, whether that's Alexander or Jake or Nog, Q's son even. And they also even talked about the idea of maybe including Jack Crusher as well. And so it does seem as though that this is it is just a mini series that's going to be happening. But it also seems as though they have some wiggle room as to how big this miniseries can be, because, if they decide to include somebody like Jack Crusher, or maybe, it's something they could maybe kind of add to as they think through. Maybe, you might even get something like David from, Star Trek too. And so all of those things I think would be really interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, comics have been coming out fast and furious in all honesty. And so, but this seems like a really interesting idea to kind of explore characters that in a lot of ways kind of end up on the sidelines of things many times. But a lot of these characters ended up becoming characters in their own right, especially when you think of, Jake and Nog specifically from Deep Space Nine.
It's kind of an interesting concept too, that I think that they could, I mean, it's going to be a mini series, but I don't see a reason why they couldn't continue it for not so much a long form, years long series or anything, but there's so many different sons and daughters in Star Trek. I mean, we could even get to a point where we have Naomi Wildman or, some other younger characters that were on the show and just get one-off or, one-shot issues that focus on each of the characters. I think that would be something really interesting and, to explore over the coming months. So, IDW is no slouch when it comes to producing Star Trek comics. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. Now, I will say that if you ask me, and this is just my personal opinion, is we going to have a bunch of comics here to review in just a moment. But I do think that the amount of comics coming out actually is probably too much. Yeah. I think as we talk through some of these comics that we are going to talk through, there are a couple of them here where, in all honesty, if I'd never read them, I would not have felt like I missed anything. And so I think what I would rather see is with the comics, if you're going to do them, I really want to see quality more than quantity. And that's, of course, how I feel about the books as well. And I don't just want a book coming out, every 5 minutes. I'd really rather have good quality. And unfortunately, I do think as much as I've enjoyed some of the comics and we've praised, I've had a great time with the ongoing Star Trek. I think Defiant. We also really enjoyed Resurgence as well, tying into the game, which was a complete surprise to us. But I think as we talk through today, there's going to be some here that I think quality needs to come first instead of quantity.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's to put things into perspective for the listeners here, since the last time we recorded, there's been 9 comic books that have come out, 6 of which we're going to talk about today. But that's, a couple a week, in the last month or so, which is a lot. And to be fair, they're all, a lot of them are by different authors and artists and everything. But there's something to be said for trying to appeal to all audiences. But I'm in complete agreement with you, Matthew. There comes a point where there's maybe too many coming out, and there's a few of these that would have been fine if they'd gotten pushed or maybe not happened at all. I don't know. I guess we'll see.
Well, to dive in then to comics, we've got Star Trek 12, which wraps up the Day of Blood series. And so I just wanted to ask you, really this is kind of the culmination of everything that we've been doing in the Day of Blood and a lot of the big push towards, not only Star Trek here, but also the Defiant series. So this is really bringing it to a close. And so how do you feel like it did in that? Because this has been a big overarching story, and they've kind of been building up with both of these comics. And so, how did it wrap up for you?
I thought it wrapped up pretty well. I mean, this is a pretty epic story that we've got here that really starts. We get a little bit of focus on all the characters that we've had so far. I mean, it's wrapping up kind of all of the storylines. I mean, it talk about jam-packed. I mean, this story is, it's got a lot to wrap up. And I think overall it did a pretty good job. And then, kind of sets the stage then for whatever might be coming next. And, I think that they're going to transition pretty well just from this the overarching story of the ongoing Star Trek comics as a whole, but also this Day of Blood story. I mean, I think we're seeing some growth in our characters and some the relationships and interactions between them kind of growing, and some I'm looking forward to seeing where they continue this story, both in Star Trek and then as we talk about Defiant in a few minutes here too.
Yeah. So for me here with the wrap-up of Day of Blood, I pretty much agree with what you said. I will say, though, that it did feel like they got to this point and they didn't quite know how to actually end the story with the epicness that they were telling, especially when we think of, Kahless trying to be a god killer. And in that, there's something, there's good and there's bad to this. Like, I thought the idea of the crew of the Defiant and the Theseus coming together and taking all of their expertise to be able to defeat this was interesting. But then it also made me feel like the idea of having the Orb of Destruction and creation almost came to a moot point, which was a little bit disappointing. And it just felt as though they had maybe written themselves into a corner, and they kind of wave almost like the magic wand, I felt like, and just be like, oh, we're out of the predicament now. And so, like you said, though, I do think that this there's some nice character growth moments here. They really do set up, I think, an interesting idea moving forward, especially with what they're going to do with the Defiant crew. And those characters that we've built here throughout this series. And so I'm very interested to see that. I think, to me, I'm still really interested, though, for the Star Trek run, diving continually more into, Sisko himself and the idea of, being a prophet, and having this type of power and what that actually means, I think is something I'm still really interested in, because they've kind of hit it here. And then at the same time, I felt like that was a thing where I thought that was the stone they were really going to overturn. And then they don't. And so, so it's a little bit of a mixed bag here, and which is interesting because I feel like it's one of my first major criticisms of this run. So now the next comic here is just a one shot called Shax's Best Day, and it is basically, I would say, a humorous look at what's happening at the end of the Day of Blood from Shax's point of view. And in all honesty, Casey, I have very little to say about this comic. I don't think that it needed to come out. I didn't enjoy it at all. And mainly just because it added nothing, because it's just this weird, I have a hard time describing it. It just felt very odd as a comic in the first place. Especially since it just didn't seem to do anything important or needed for the story that we had been telling. It just seemed to exist.
I agree 100% with that. I can see what they were trying to do, that, with trying to appeal to Lower Decks fans. We've had Shax in the Day of Blood series, which was kind of cool to see him there. This one, it's written in the vein of the Star Trek Lower Decks comics, which we kind of liked. We thought that those would even have made great episodes. This one, this would be one that if it was an episode of the show Lower Decks, I would have been like, well, that was there, and there were definitely funny parts. Shax is a funny character and everything, but it just didn't hit like the other Lower Decks comics, with, little quips at the bottom of each page. I just felt like that was just extra stuff to read. So, I mean, it's always fun seeing Shax and seeing some different formats of the comics, but this one just didn't add anything. Yeah, it was a side quest that we didn't need to have, I feel like, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it hit different in a way that just is like, ugh, to me, I just was kind of, from almost the very first panel, I was put off by it. And I just it was one of those things where I'm like, I thought to myself, why am I reading this? And so, which was different when we came to Defiant 8, which is a follow-up to, it is the direct follow-up to what happened in the Day of Blood for the crew of the Defiant, so you've got Worf and Ro and B'Elanna Torres, the Orion healer that's been with them, as well as, of course, Lore, and of course Spock as well. And I thought that this was a fascinating way to take this group of characters because, they're all renegades at this point. They've all disobeyed Starfleet, and they're not being necessarily punished, but they're basically being created as Starfleet's unofficial bounty hunters, which I think is really an interesting way to take this, because the Defiant itself too is a ship that's been decommissioned, almost like the original Enterprise, and so this whole thing is just really interesting to me. And you've got all of these characters that are going to be a part of the series. Spock is going to continue on with the group, and I find myself in a place where, okay, this is completely unexpected, but I'm really interested to see where they do take this.
Yeah, same here. This is kind of a transition from the Day of Blood to what they're going to do next, and they titled this particular issue Another Piece of the Action Part 1, and I almost feel like this could have been a Part 0, really, since it is literally transitioning us from the events of Day of Blood into this new one where the events of this book are setting up what's to come next. And with the name Another Piece of the Action and some of the information that we get in this comic, you might be in your mind tying it back to an original series episode, and I think you would be right to be thinking that. And then some of the other characters that they've really teased in this one that will be coming up, I think, are good picks for what we're going to be seeing, especially with this particular crew and how this series is unfolding. I feel like I've been saying that a lot with the Star Trek ongoing series and with Defiant. I'm really looking forward to seeing where they take this, because I think that the way that they're setting this up, there's a lot of really interesting things that they could do.
Well, I think you brought up a really great point, the idea of, we are clearly going to be going back to Sigma Iosha 2 because of, and one of the cool things I love about how they've done both of these comics is how they give us like the Lacar's text. Mm-hmm. So it's like the after action reports or captain's, logs and those kind of things, which I think make this feel very Star Trek-y in that way, because that's so much a part of Star Trek. Oh, we're reading this report, or, this, like you said, I think this just creates an interesting avenue for a lot of these characters to go forward with. I think one of the things I'm most interested in is how this is going to impact the relationship between Tom and B'Elanna Paris, mm-hmm. because this is going to change their relationship as she's a part of this group and he's on the Theseus and, everything. So I'll be really interested to see how that plays out. But yeah, I mean, you're 100% right in the sense that I think that they just, with each kind of mini arc with these series for Star Trek and Defiant, keep coming up with interesting hooks to lead you into the next part of the story, which is great, which is exactly what you want from a comic series. So I can't wait to see where that goes. We do have the final issue of Motion Picture Echoes. And how do you feel like this one wrapped up and ended?
This one was a mixed bag for me. This isn't one that I'd say that I'd have been okay if they didn't have. I thought that the whole Motion Picture Echoes run was kind of an interesting concept. Wasn't quite mirror universe. It was just kind of parallel or alternate universe. This one, I hate to say it, but this particular issue is actually pretty forgettable for me. And I say that because I'm kind of flipping through the pages right now, wondering if I read it, and I know I did. But yeah, it's I think overall the whole concept was interesting. But here's another place, actually, I guess, that I'd say too, where the whole concept of the Bajoran orbs was not needed, or like they kind of didn't know what to do with it. And so, by the time we get to the end here, it's like we're kind of back to the status quo. And of course, we've got the alternate universe Uhura giving advice to Kirk, which of course he's going to, or not necessarily advice, but just kind of almost premonitions, of losing Spock and things that of course come to fruition. But it was interesting. I don't know that it really necessarily, I would say, helped our characters grow in any way that, we hope that our literary fiction does. But I don't know. I think if you're a fan of the motion picture era, I would still say that this is, a good 5-issue run to go through, and, you get some interesting action in it too.
I find myself very much in your camp here, in that I think that this issue is unfortunately incredibly forgetful. I think this whole series is incredibly forgetful, and mainly because I think the main problem with it is that the echoes feel too similar to the Mirror Universe, and yet they're not the Mirror Universe. And so therefore, there's just nothing about this comic series that I find interesting. There was never an interesting idea explored that hadn't been explored before, basically by having the Mirror Universe. And so I think unfortunately, this was one I was actually very excited for because I love this period, and yet nothing about it gave me anything to enjoy, really, personally. I honestly wasn't really a huge fan of the art, and I thought the story was incredibly lackluster, and I thought it did nothing for the characters, in all honesty. So I found this, and what you could have done, I think, really with this series is created an interesting arc for Chekhov that would have set him on a course to want to pursue command in the way that you see him pursuing that in Star Trek II with being on the Reliant, and really just, they never just dig into any of those type of things. And so, incredibly frustrating, but maybe not quite as frustrating as the Scorpious Run 2, our Strange New Worlds comic that we're having, which, all honesty, Casey, I can't understand this story at all. I can't understand why I should be interested in it. And I find it to be just incredibly, the issues themselves, the art feels like a visual mess. There's so much happening on every single panel that it's almost hard to even distinguish what's going on. And again, this is just, I think that there's a way to do this story better and more interestingly, but there's nothing quite that interesting about this story, unfortunately. So
yeah, this is one I think that had a lot of promise in the first issue. Like, it could have just been a fun, little mission for the crew to go on, but unfortunately, I agree. It was hard to follow in this issue, and I'm concerned, especially by the end of this issue, where I'm concerned about where they're going to go with it and how they're going to resolve these things. And we've got this like godlike being that is basically, anytime the Enterprise crew or any of our people or ships or anything are figuring their way out of a situation, the godlike being is rewriting the rules and just making it up as he goes, to the point where there really is no winning. Like, the crew tries to go save another ship, and if they do that, they're going to get destroyed anyway. So what's the point? And, so we're seeing our valiant crew doing things for no particular reason. I don't see the point. And like you said, like the art is good, but like you said, it is so busy that it's almost weird to say that the art is so good, that it's actually distracting. But there's just so much going on in every single panel here. that sometimes it's just really hard to understand what's going on and what I'm supposed to be focusing on. And, it's not even that there's just like Easter eggs or anything like that. It's just like, somebody spent an incredible amount of time doing the artwork for this, and almost to a fault. And it seems like backhanded compliment. Your art is really good. So good, in fact, that it's kind of ruining the story. But, I don't really know how to exactly put my finger on it. But yeah, I don't know. Obviously, we'll keep reading it, and, perhaps we'll get surprised and we'll get some really good things out of the future issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so. I would like that because, we enjoyed the previous Strange New Worlds comic for the most part. We thought both of them were pretty decent, and this one just seems to not be living up to the potential that you could have. So we start a new series now, Picard's Academy. We get number 1 here, and I am very interested to see what it is that you think of this one, because I definitely have some very strong thoughts on it.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, and I feel like I've seen this comment online before. I don't know how to explain it, but on the cover art, his torso is backwards. I feel like we're looking at his back, but I don't know if it's just how it's drawn. But this is another one that is an interesting concept for me. I thought, we know very little about Picard's Academy days, and we had even way back in probably the early 90s, I think we had those Starfleet or Star Trek The Next Generation Starfleet Academy young adult books, and none of those ever featured Picard from what I recall. And so we just really don't have a lot of information about his past. And I don't necessarily think I like the way they took this, though. The artwork is interesting. It's a little lower deck-y, a little, I don't know. It's not what I guess I would have thought from a Picard-centric story. It seems like it's geared to younger readers. And I just didn't, I don't know, didn't get it. The humor was a little bit lost on me. There was a couple parts that I thought were kind of, I got a chuckle, but otherwise I don't know what we're doing with the story or where it's leading. Are we going to end up on that fateful day at the Dom Jot table that we saw in Star Trek The Next Generation? I don't know. This is one of those ones that had they never announced it, I would not have anything missing from my life.
I think that the main problem with this comic is the fact that they are going for this very odd lower deck style feel for a comic with Picard in it, which does not work because that is not who Picard is at all. And I also think that the problem is that the way that it's written is so ridiculously juvenile and yet so not for juveniles in the first place with the language that's being used here. Absolutely nothing about this comic works. I kind of loathe it. And I don't say that about many things, but I think this is a terrible misfire. I wish if you wanted to do this, I think the problem is that the idea of exploring Picard in his Academy years is an incredibly interesting idea, right? Especially when Picard is in the Academy. It's in that period we know very little about Starfleet history. We're talking about the Enterprise C era, which I've always wanted to know more about. I think this is just a travesty. It's just not good. And I'm very disappointed with it. And I'm really incredibly disappointed with the tone that it's taken. I think it's inappropriate for Picard. I think it's just inappropriate in general because I can't imagine really any adults liking this because it's written, it feels like, for 12-year-olds, but it's not something I would have handed a 12-year-old. So I just, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, yeah, it's like they took those old Starfleet Academy young adult novels, tried to do it in comic form, but upped the language a bit. And I mean, I've got, nieces that are in the 12-year-old range, and I know they've heard words that I probably didn't know back when I was that age. But to label something with Star Trek and put some of the language in here that they did is, as an adult, like I said, I got a little chuckle sometimes, but yeah, like I would never hand this to a young person and say, read it. Don't ever say anything that they say in it, or don't call people the names that they call people in here. Some of the things that we know just from the episode Tapestry, Picard was kind of reckless. Sometimes he got into fights, and he, the fact that he got stabbed through the heart by a Nausicaan, shows what kind of person he is. But here he's like this book nerd guy that is also pretty hot-headed and doesn't have any friends, which some of that kind of works, but just, I don't know, not the way they did it here. And you even got Boothby showing up, who looks nothing like Boothby, and telling Picard to go out and make friends, and Picard saying, well, you're my friend, you're my only friend, which is not the not really the impression we got. We got in the show, I feel like Boothby was more the mentor, not Picard's only friend. So just some of the ways that they're taking this are just, kind of big misses here. So it's unfortunate with a Picard, something that's supposed to be tied into Star Trek Picard, really. Just pretty unfortunate.
Well, I think you said it well. The Lower Decks is created specifically for Star Trek fans that are adults. With the way that it's formatted, everything about that show is for adults. It's adult humor, and the way that this is written, the look of the comic itself, it just feels so juvenile, and yet at the same time, like, it's not. And so, yeah, it's just a disappointment for me all around. And so be interested to see, I guess where it goes. But we'll have coming up a review of all of the issues of Halloween in our next episode. And so we just figured with what we've got here so far, it's better just to do the entire series and talk about that entire series once it's finished, because it's got one more issue as we're recording now. So it seems kind of silly to just talk about 3 and then have the wait. So we'll talk about that. But Casey, I think maybe it's time to go talk about Patrick Stewart's brand new memoir.
Make it so.
Well, Casey, it's interesting because here on Literary Treks, we've only done this once before, where we have a nonfiction book that is a memoir by one of the cast members. And there are lots of memoirs that have come out from different cast members. But this will be the second time we've done this. And instead of Kate Mulgrew, we are going to be talking about Patrick Stewart's Making It So. And I do have to say, I felt like this was so much fun to be able to dive into, and mainly because, and I wanted to ask you this before we kind of even started talking about the book itself, but, the majority of this book really takes place with his early life and his stage work and kind of setting the scene for what gets him to Star Trek. I mean, I would say almost 2/3 of the book really feel like that. And then the rest of it is kind of coming to Hollywood, being a part of Star Trek and all of those things. And I wanted to ask you how you felt about that, because, obviously we're a Star Trek podcast. And was that something that you expected? Did you appreciate having all of that backstory? Were you glad that, we got to spend more time there? Or did you want more in depth about, the seasons of Star Trek and then, of course, the films and then Picard?
Yeah, no, I really, I'm glad that he went through, really from his parents' history to some extent too. We learned a little bit about his parents, like right at the very beginning before he even gets into his life, just to kind of set the stage, to use a pun, for his life, like especially his early life going forward. And I think I love reading biographies, autobiographies, memoirs, things like this, just especially of people that I look up to and enjoy learning more about. And we know Patrick Stewart from Star Trek. We know him from X-Men and maybe even some of the other things in Hollywood he's done. And we also know that he has done a lot of stage work, but I've never really known a lot about that. So I was really glad that he spent so much time going through that history, because that's really what made him who he's become, today. So I'm glad he didn't glance over that part, because believe it or not, there's people who don't know him from Star Trek or maybe X-Men, which I was surprised at how little X-Men he really talked about. But, we got Star Trek peppered throughout. He had little quips and little, look forwards to, Star Trek memories. But yeah, I mean, those pre-Star Trek days are probably some of my favorite parts of the book, just because of hearing about young Patrick Stewart. Yeah,
I mean, I find myself right there with you on this one, because, being a Star Trek fan, I know a lot of the stories that go along with, Patrick Stewart, his time with, Star Trek, of course, with The Next Generation, and then with the movies, and then even moving, of course, into Picard. And part of that is just because, websites and news organizations that are linked with Star Trek give us so much of this information. And so it's not as though that stuff isn't already out there. And I think I'm right there with you in the sense that having him be able to give us, I think, a better taste of who he is as a fully rounded person, where he comes from, and all of that was just much more interesting to me than having, chapter after chapter about, things that I most likely may have already known. And I think, one of the things that when I think through, we're just going to kind of talk through his life then as presented in the memoir. And, his early life I found to be utterly fascinating because of the fact that he's not, an incredible student. He's somebody who is definitely struggling to find his place. And he's growing up in a household where, unfortunately, there is domestic violence happening. And this is not easy for him. But I wanted to ask you about this because the domestic violence that he experiences, I found the way in which he approaches this to be incredibly moving, because instead of being angry at his father, and he never gives us any indication that he is excusing his father's behavior, but the work that he has done to understand his father's behavior and where it may have come from, I was just, again, utterly fascinated by, because most people, I feel like, might come from that situation and just be still incredibly angry. And yet the take that he has was so beautifully balanced between both of his parents and trying to understand where they were both coming from, what was happening, while at the same time never, ever excusing the horrendous behavior his father exhibited towards his mother, not their whole lives, but for a portion of their lives. And I just found that to be so interesting. And really, I think, to me, it told me so much about who he is as a person now. It was really insightful.
Yeah, he didn't have to write anything in this book. He didn't have to touch on that at all. He could have, said, I grew up in an abusive household, was subject to my father's anger or whatever it was, and then just blown over it and left it. But I agree. Like, a lot of that was very touching. And even when it came down to the end of his father's life, and, he was talking about how he felt he needed, closure when his father passed away, but not to the point where he really said a goodbye or anything like that to his father, or to his father's body or whatever, when he went to the, I think you referred to it as an undertaker, but, his father was always a part of his life. And I think he tried to make it for the better and learn from it. And, just that and so many of the other parts, especially of his early life, but just all of the hard things that he talked about throughout this book, the embarrassments that he felt for certain things, and just the raw emotion that he put into it was pretty moving, because we got a very intimate glimpse into his life that, you don't get to see from a lot of people. And to hear him, and I do say hear him because I did listen to the audiobook too, read by Patrick Stewart. So there was also, very moving aspect to that too. But to hear him talk about these things and just be so open and kind of naked with his stories, just putting everything out there for us, that, some things that can sometimes be very private things, very personal things. And, it's an interesting choice that he decided to do that. But at the same time, I mean, he's kind of trying to say that these are things that he's learned about himself through life and about other people, and, kind of using it as an educational experience, I guess, for anybody who's reading about his story. So maybe they can take something that in their life if they're experiencing something similar.
Yeah. I mean, speaking to that too, when you think about, and as I was reading, especially as he was, early being trained in theater, and the people that he's being trained with, Brian Blessed and, Ben Kingsley. These are the names are ones that we all know. And just to realize that that's the milieu that, Patrick Stewart was growing up in, being trained by, and being trained with, really, because they're all of similar age. It was just incredible, the amount of people that, of course, he's been able to work with. And, I loved being able to get a peek in the window of what that kind of world is like. And, I think it's interesting too, because I've definitely been to some plays, and I've been to more musicals than I have plays. And so I'm familiar a little bit with theater, but, of course, unless, you live in a major metropolitan area like a New York, or even a LA, maybe San Francisco, where, major theaters are like Broadway and whatnot. Theater is not quite the same as it is, I feel like, in England specifically, Europe as well. But to get a behind the stage look at, what it's like to put these things on, to learn to do these things, I thought was really, really interesting. And one of the stories that really stuck out to me was when he's doing the play with Ian Holm, and who is, to him, a god of theater at this point. And Ian Holm just freezes and cannot continue. Mm-hmm. And then, he talks about, Ian finding his place in being able to go to Hollywood and really kind of find his place there. But that was something that was just fascinating to see, the way in which even people like that, they can struggle with this, being on stage. They can struggle with this job that they're doing. And I found that to be an incredibly moving story. Just again, you were mentioning earlier the raw emotion that I think that Patrick Stewart does and is able to kind of put into the stories that he tells. And I think he just writes in a way whenever he tells a story like that where it feels as though, he's telling the story by almost putting himself into the shoes of the person he's sharing about, because he did share those experiences. And to me, that was another great way. And this, this is a world that I'm not very familiar with, whereas I am very familiar with, acting on film, and I've heard many stories about Star Trek and all that kind of stuff. So to get these type of insights into a world that I'm not very familiar with was really enjoyable, and I'm really glad that he went this direction with the book.
Yeah, he was from his earliest times of even trying to get into theater and get into school for it. We have this view of celebrities as always, kind of coming from a place of privilege and potentially wealth. And, especially when you're talking about Shakespearean actors who are very famous from London or somewhere in England. But he came from very humble beginnings, I guess. His family was poor. He wasn't sure how he was going to pay for school. And then being able to kind of relate to his struggles as he came up, he's trying to get just on stage, non-speaking roles, or even just getting one or two lines just so he can show what he can do. Watching him go through or listening to him go through, these audition processes and getting the rejections that we hear about other actors, like film and television actors, talking about, like hating the audition process, and finding out he went through all these same things too. And yeah, like you said, as he comes up, he's got his idols that he's just hoping to even be on the same stage with, be in the same play with, potentially share a scene with at some point. And him coming to the realization that these are just people too, that they're also struggling actors who are struggling with their own things, whether it's some kind of, maybe not necessarily stage fright, which is kind of what Ian Holm, I guess, kind of suffered from to some extent, but they're fallible humans too, and really kind of putting a human spin on these names of people that we know. And what's funny too is just his humility, I guess, to some extent, once he started becoming more of a known actor, probably more once he was on TV, but even back in his Royal Shakespeare Company days, and him getting so excited to meet somebody. And then I can't remember there was some actor that he was so excited to meet, and they were basically the same excited to see him and meet with him because they saw him in some other play too. And a lot of relatable stories, I guess, in this of his time coming up. And, and he had so many stage stories, but just the people that he met and his journey along the way, reaching his dream of being in the Royal Shakespeare Company, but then having other opportunities come along that he wants to explore as well. It's just so relatable for somebody that you'd look at and go, well, that's Sir Patrick Stewart. I could never relate to him, and then getting all of these stories that tell you, sure you can.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that, because I do think that he does a great job of, because he comes from such humble beginnings, I think there is a part of him, and he even mentions, in the end, he even mentions throughout the book that he does enjoy the finer things in life, right? Like he comes to enjoy those type of things.
Yeah.
But there's always a sense to which, because he has those beginnings, in a small town, with, very little to his name, you get the sense like, and I appreciated this about him, that he never has taken for granted the success that he's been able to have. And I liked that about in the way that he tells the stories that he's had. He's never above in the book talking about the almost the luck, that he's been able to have with some things, and he never portrays himself as like, oh, I earned this, or it's there's a humility there, and I really do think that's something that is one of the things that's made him such a indelible actor to so many people, is that sense of humility that he has, and the way that but at the same time, the way he is able to kind of carry himself with confidence, even if he doesn't have it, which is what, I think made him such a great person for Picard, but at the same time, I think one of the things that he does throughout, especially the early part of the book, is he is not somebody who has ever had a lot of people that are very close to him, which I thought was interesting, and him building that up actually led wonderfully into, him playing Picard and being able to kind of find that character and figure out what it was supposed to be. But in many ways, without him spending so much time on his earlier life, I don't know if I would have appreciated actually us getting to the stories about, Star Trek and him trying to figure out the character of Picard and all those things without having that kind of context.
That's a really good point that I didn't actually pick up on, but, now that you mention it, it seems so obvious that he never sounded super lonely, I don't think, but yeah, he didn't have kind of like a lot, like an inner circle of people that he ran around with or anything. Like, he met people along his journey, and, in a couple different cases throughout his life, he married one, but, it does kind of, it does put into context how, and these are stories we've heard before about the early days of Next Generation, where he was so serious and we're not here to play, we're here to work. And, not that he wasn't trying to build friendships on the set of Next Generation, but just that he'd never been involved in something quite as long, and, even wanted to, I don't know, move along with certain people. I mean, he, just, it's an actor's life, going from job to job to job, and he might be with a company for quite a while. And I mean, Royal Shakespeare Company, he was with for, I think he said 14 years. And so, I mean, there's a kind of a revolving door of people that go through there, and you probably get close to some and then they leave, and then you might not see each other for a long time. And there was many times throughout this that he said that he never got a chance to see certain people ever again because their paths just didn't cross. But yeah, it is interesting that his life really does, and he even said too at one point that except for the fact that he in real life loves children, but Picard was supposed to not care for children too much, but that his life really did prepare him to play this character, which I do remember now too, one of his previous theater directors even saying something like he was having trouble finding the character, and the director said, well, you are the character, just use your own history, your own life, to play this character. And another good lesson I feel like that most of us can kind of take is that, we're kind of our characters in our own stories here, but, we can always draw on our history, our past to inform our current, and our future. And I feel like he was kind of learning that lesson along the way and trying to infuse that into the characters that he was playing too.
One of the things that I was a little bit disappointed of in the book is that he didn't talk about, because, we get him being in Dune and talking about that. And of course, and I've heard that story before about his experience with the whole thing there. I mean, it was not great with him and David Lynch because of an honest mistake that nobody really wanted to own up to in the end. But I really wanted to actually hear about his experience on Excalibur. And there's nothing in the book about that, which I was actually disappointed that he didn't have anything to share about that, because I felt like that would have been really interesting, because, that was one of his first roles in a movie. And I felt like that would have been kind of fascinating to be able to hear more about. And I kind of, he was doing such a good job of talking through a lot of things. We didn't get to hear that. So I was a little disappointed in not getting to see what his experience was like on that film.
Yeah, it is interesting. I hadn't really thought of that either. And, but he did mention conspiracy theory of all movies, which
yes,
seemed like such a strange one to mention among all the other things. I mean, I love that movie, but of all of his repertoire, his filmography, the ones that he didn't mention, and I would be curious to know, like, why were there? I mean, he obviously couldn't just list off everything he's ever done, but especially in his early film career. I mean, Dune is a very big one that a lot of people are familiar with, but Excalibur was another one that kind of put him on the map, and certainly there's others before Star Trek came along. I would have liked to hear more, because I feel like we just got a couple of those little stories before we jumped, once he got to Hollywood. Before Next Generation, there wasn't a lot of lead up to that, and that would have been nice to have a little bit more, just kind of reminiscence and stories, and maybe he just couldn't think of any. I don't know, like that, from nothing interesting enough to put in a book or something.
Yeah, that could be the case. It just might have been that, work on Borman's Excalibur wasn't super interesting for him, and he doesn't have an extremely large role in it either, so that could also be a part of that. But it would have been something that I would have been interesting to know. I do, when we talk about, him writing about his Star Trek work, I think the thing that I was actually most interested in with the Star Trek work, because I've heard so many of the stories, of course, that he's told over the years at conventions, which then, of course, trickles out to what we get on the internet. But I was actually really interested, and I wanted more about his experiences on the films, and I was a little bit disappointed that he didn't spend more time with, specifically, he praises, of course, like he always does. He loves First Contact, but I wanted to know more about, his thought process on Generations, and and especially with Insurrection and Nemesis, and I would have enjoyed hearing kind of more of his musings on. I know, he talks about being frustrated with Generations and them adding Kirk and everything, but then it turns out, him and Bill Shatner turn out to be great friends because of that. And I guess the one that I would have been most interested in knowing more about was Insurrection.
Yeah.
And because it's just a film almost that I feel like gets forgotten. And it's not a terrible film, but it's not a great film. It's just kind of, there. And I really would have liked to have heard, what he thought, because there were so many different ways that film was also thought of going as well. So that's the one where I just wish he had added more.
I agree. It was, I was really hoping for more movies, especially because he did go into some depth on Generations and his, like you said, his frustrations with bringing Kirk in there, his excitement with getting to work with Malcolm McDowell, and he did kind of refer to Generations as an extended episode, which I don't. It's funny because I feel the same way about, I've always said the same thing about Insurrection, that it just feels like an extended episode, which to me doesn't seem like it should be a bad thing. And maybe it's not something that people go to the theaters for, but I would like to have heard more about, well, I mean, all he ever did was mention Insurrection. Like, I mean, it was literally like he was just listing off the movies after First Contact. But I would have liked to have had some, like, there had to be some stories from there, and maybe even some frustrations. Like, did they have frustrations when they were making it? He did mention that with Nemesis, he felt like they didn't have a very strong movie, and I've heard stories about that one was frustrating for them to make. It was interesting hearing him talk about Tom Hardy, but I mean, the fact that he did Generations, he did First Contact, he mentions Insurrection, and gives a small story about Tom Hardy on Nemesis. I understand they get frustrated with their works, and, some of those films might be kind of a bummer, but it's kind of like Excalibur. It's like, you got to have something for us. Like, tell me something here. But I mean, it's clear that for him, Insurrection was kind of an afterthought, and even Nemesis was just kind of the way they had to end things at that time of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I definitely agree with you on that. And, I think it would have been interesting, because, fascinating story, obviously, about Tom Hardy and the fact that, he just had no rapport with the cast. He didn't seem to care to have rapport with the cast. I know Hardy was, of course, a very young man at the time, and, doesn't seem to necessarily handle things all that well. But that film, of course, was also plagued with a lot of problems having to do with the choice of director and all of that. So, I think you're right in saying it just seems strange that we just got, and maybe it's just one of those things for him, Insurrection is honestly not even worth remembering. It was there and he moved on. I thought it was also, like you said, he mentions conspiracy theory, which I thought was interesting. And that was also one I would have loved to have heard more about, because, he gets to play the villain in that movie, which is, such a different role for him, especially at that time. Working with Julia Roberts and Mel Gibson, I would have loved to have heard more about what that was like as well. So it's a little bit disappointing that we didn't get an opportunity to hear more about that. And I would have actually really enjoyed hearing even more about his work in X-Men. Because, I mean, he's in a lot of the movies. He's in most of them, actually. And I really would have been fascinated to hear his thoughts on the whole series, but specifically one that I wish he had gotten a chance to, and he spent more time on, would have been Days of Future Past, because it's such a pivotal movie in the series. I love that we got a lot on Logan, which was fantastic, but Days of the Future Past is awesome. And I would have loved to have heard what, he had to say about that.
Yeah, it is interesting because, I mean, he clearly, like you mentioned at the beginning, like he spent a good 2/3 or more of the book pre-Next Generation, and X-Men has been such a big part. I mean, it was like at the end of the 90s. I mean, at this point when this book comes out, it's 25 years old or something, whatever the first X-Men came out. Right? Yeah, it's 2023 now. So, but it's, I don't know, like I enjoyed hearing how he got involved with it and his first meeting with Hugh Jackman and things like that. But yeah, that's just another part where I just wondered, did he not have a lot to say? Were some of these X-Men movies just kind of there for him? Because yeah, he spends a lot of time on Logan, which is arguably one of the best X-Men movies potentially, and kind of the most real to some extent, and working with Hugh Jackman, and I can't remember the little girl's name now from that movie, but I would have liked to just hear more, just about the progression from the original cast of the X-Men to the younger cast in Days of Future Past, and then, again into Logan, and even the small part he played in Doctor Strange too, and bringing that character back when he killed off Logan, or he killed off Xavier in Logan. Spoiler alert for any non-X-Men people, but I don't know. There's, he's known for, like, in America for really two things, Captain Picard and Professor X. And he just spends so little time on that Professor X piece that I was just kind of shocked by it, I guess, that he just didn't seem to have a lot to say.
Yeah, I was shocked by that too. I wanted to ask you too about, he does spend some time, of course, with Picard, and I was really interested about the way in which he talks about this, because a lot of the stuff I feel like I know pretty well, and this was another place where I would have very much liked more of his thoughts on how, especially the first two seasons played out, because I guess for me as a fan, one of my questions for him would have been the way those two seasons play out are really because of your stipulations and what you're in a lot of ways. And are you happy with it? Because I don't think, I think the consensus, really for the first two seasons is that they're either okay or not very good. And I really would have loved to have seen him kind of do some soul searching about those first two seasons of Picard specifically.
Yeah, I'd agree, especially because he devoted some time to being pitched the idea and listing out for us in his own words his three stipulations for coming back. Almost all of which were kind of went out the window in the first season anyways, because he did end up in a uniform. He did wear a comm badge. There were, three of the Next Gen cast members that showed up in it. And, but even when he was kind of going in depth about season 3 and really talking about that, his vision for the final scene with some woman's voice, which he said would have been voiced by his real life wife, but just some voice calling him in for dinner or whatever it was, and kind of leaving it on this ambiguous note of, was that Beverly? Was that Laris? Was that somebody else? Did he finally find love? Which was something that kind of did get, and he was talking about leaving it on this just big question mark, which I kind of feel like they did anyway. We got a little closure with him and Beverly, but Laris just goes off to whatever planet she was going off at the beginning of season 3, and we never hear from her again. And, the fact that he even devoted some time to talking, very little time in the book, but at least mentioning her and her character in the book, I kind of would have liked to know where is Laris? Where, what happened to her? And we built up so much between them in the first couple seasons, and really the first season, but even some in the second season that just kind of got left on the floor. I feel like once they decided on a path for season 3.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by that, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it was definitely something I wanted to be able to talk about. And to me, and this is just my thoughts on this. So, but I think that this goes to show that actors don't always know their characters the way we think they do, and they don't always know what's best for their characters and don't necessarily understand the story completely. To me, season 3 of Picard is so much about the importance of family, and Picard finally getting that, especially after season 2. And of course, it's up and down nature, but really about kind of helping him become emotionally whole, so that, by the time you get to season 3, he can have this experience that will lead him to the thing that he's always pushed aside and denied himself. And so I think it's really weird to me that, he would say his desire was to have it be almost this ambiguous end. Is it Beverly? Is it Laris? Is it somebody else? It's like, that's not the story that was being told, And to me, the story was about him finally having a family, and that, the answer in the end was, yes, it's Beverly, Yeah. And so to me, I that was a weird one to have him, and I'm glad that they didn't do it, because I think the ending that they got was much better, and it did allow us to be able to, I think, get the closure, if this was the last time we see all of those characters that fans would have wanted, And again, I think sometimes you get actors and they want things to be super artsy fartsy, and that's just, to me, I don't think that that's what the season called for, and it didn't seem to fit with the rest of the season anyway. So,
well, and I think too that, looking over his stipulations for returning as Picard, some of them are kind of, it was more, it feels like it's more the actor saying, I don't want to wear a uniform again. I don't want to be on the bridge of a spaceship again. I want to, explore other parts of the character. But I, Patrick Stewart, don't want to have to get into that crazy futuristic wardrobe again. I want to wear something comfortable or whatever, whatever his reasons were behind that. But what I think, regardless of how anybody feels about the first season or the second season, those stipulations, and however loosely they followed them, did make the writers think outside the box and come up with what could have been an interesting story and path to take the character on. In hindsight, I wish they would have kind of started with what they did in season 3 and just carried that through 3 seasons and just made it a next generation reunion without calling it one. Because as we saw in season 3, everybody can have their time to shine, but it's still a story about Picard. And that's something that did get lost in the first couple seasons that, I think that we could have had similar elements to those stories in seasons 1 and 2 and had it basically be a more meaningful story to Picard that leads a little bit better into season 3 than some of the confused storytelling I think that we got early on. But, I think that what we got in season 3 is what I would want to see more of, or more follow on to, I guess. He even mentions like, we've probably seen the last of Picard, but he does want another crack at a movie and wants Jonathan Frakes to direct it. And I think if they did it in a similar vein to what they did in season 3 of Picard, I think that could make another First Contact kind of movie that he's looking for. And I don't know, is that something you'd want to see as another shot at a feature film for him?
I mean, I think that if you have this written by somebody like Terry Matalas, 100% would love to see that. I think that would be fantastic. I think, that's the kind of story I would love to see happen, because I think that they did such a fantastic job with the third season. So it's one of those things where if it's done right, I think it could actually do it. And so, yeah, I would love it if that happened. But I think it's one of those things where it just it would have to be done right. And I think everybody would agree with that, right? You that's not, I don't think I'm saying anything that any fan is going to be like, nah, just get whoever, because obviously with the Star Trek The Next Generation movies, we've already seen the ways in which, those don't turn out well if they aren't, done by the right people, And so I 100% think that you would have to be very, very careful about, who you got to do that. So, but I mean, yeah, I'd love to kind of, I wouldn't mind seeing that happen. It'd be great. Was there, for you, was there anything else that just kind of stuck out to you about the stories that he had? Was there anything else that that you would have loved to have seen or enjoyed, or was there anything else that you feel like you would have liked to have known about, or was there anything else that kind of surprised you in the book?
Well, I'll say that if anybody listening here has not read it, you should. And I would even suggest the audiobook. Hearing it from Patrick Stewart himself was great, because when he's acting out scenes, it's one thing to read it in the text, but to hear him actually, play both parts, or, re-deliver the lines from First Contact. And one of the things, though, I would say that I was trying not to be, a critic, I guess, as I was reading the book, but some of the things that stuck out to me in a slightly negative way, or, I guess maybe kind of took me out of it just a little bit, was sometimes there were little comparisons he'd make, or little kind of, I don't know, superlative language, I guess, that he'd use sometimes, or, he'd say something like, and I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but he'd be like, it felt like Harrison Ford in Raiders of the Lost Ark when he was blah, 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 and like describing something that he had like no part in, had maybe liked a movie or a play or whatever it was he was referring to, but it just seemed like it came out of nowhere. And, every once in a while I was like, did the editors make you add words? And so that's how you did it. But I mean, there was a handful of places like that. Then every once in a while, especially in the first chapter of the book, really, when he's giving a lot of little not so subtle Star Trek quips when he says to engage, or, when he's dreaming, like looking at the clouds, dreaming as a boy of flying high above the clouds, boldly going somewhere, and it was just like, okay, we get it. You're Captain Picard. Let's get into your life. But no, I mean, it was fun, and it was fun hearing him, and again, reading these stories from him. It's just a really interesting and intimate look at his life that hard to kind of pick it apart too much without being really petty like I just was.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think coming to a book like this, there are all things that we would love to hear somebody to be able to talk about, and so and with a life like Patrick Stewart's had, it would be difficult to write about everything everyone would want to hear about. And so, but all in all, I mean, just for rating's sake, for me, I mean, I think that this is really good. I really enjoyed the book. I thought he'd do he did such a wonderful job of allowing us to be a part of his life, to understand what it's been like for him. And I very much enjoyed this book. And I mean, it's 4 out of 5 pips. You know, if there's a 5th pip, he should have had it. I guess that makes you an admiral, right? So, I thought it was great. It's really a fun read. I think he has a very conversational style with his writing, so it was an easy read in that way. And like you said, I can imagine the audiobook being so worth having to have him read it. So absolutely, like I couldn't imagine, this book being really much better. There's a few things I would have loved to have heard more of, but hey, that's okay.
Yeah, I will also give this one 4 pairs of tights out of 5.
Nice.
It's I would like to, after reading this, we've had Kate Mulgrew's book, Bill Shatner's written several. I would really like to read something by Avery Brooks about his life and everything. I think getting the opportunity to hear from somebody like Patrick Stewart in their own words, it's one thing to read a biography that's somebody's done some research, even if it's while somebody's alive, and this biographer is following them around. And, one of my favorites is Walter Isaacson, who wrote Steve Jobs. He wrote Elon Musk. Like, I love his writing style, but it's such another thing to really get to hear things in the, I was going to say the author, but in the person's own words about their life. And they're recreating things from memory. They're probably, building some stuff up for a little bit of dramatic flair and effect and everything. But especially for this one, it's so worth a read. If you're a fan of Star Trek, if you're a fan of X-Men, if you're a fan of theater, this is definitely a good one to pick up and read or listen to.
Well, Casey, it's always a joy to be able to get together and talk about Star Trek book, but it's a lot of fun to be able to do something very different and talk about Patrick Stewart's memoir. But I'm excited. We hope to have some great things coming up for everyone here in Literary Trek soon, and so always be on the lookout for that. But if people wanted to catch up with you and see what else you've got going on these days, where would they reach out to you?
Well, you can find me on Goodreads and Letterboxd at Knitting Trekkie, and you can also find me hovering and lurking and whatever around in the Babel Conference on Facebook. And Matt, when you're not prepping for your next major non-speaking role in a theater production, where can people find you?
Well, it's a lot of hard work, but of course you can find me all over social media under the name Matt Rushing02. Of course, here on the network, you can also find me talking about all the franchises outside of Star Trek we love in the 602 Club. And then for Star Trek, you can also find me with The Orb, Warp 5, Saddle Up, and The Artificial Tango. Over on the Nerd Party Network, you can find me with 2 shows. One is called Outpost, talking about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And you can also find me on Aggressive Negotiations, talking about Star Wars each and every week with John Mills. But thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number 1.